back. So Velvet Underground, the first time we talk about this band on the countdown. This is their second album after their debut album, Velvet Underground and Nico. So this album is White Light, White Heat, of course. It came out in 1968. It is currently 25 on besteveralbums.com, albums of the 60s. Now I'm going to talk a little bit. We're going to talk about their debut album later on in the podcast as we get to closing out the 60s, as that's considered one of the best ever albums of the 60s. So I'm going to give some bio now though about them and how we get to White Light, White Heat. Lou Reed was in New York City and was performing in some garage bands and was working as a songwriter for Pickwick Records at the time. He described himself as a, quote, poor man's Carole King, working as a thing, which I thought was funny. Reed met John Cale during this time in the New York City avant-garde art scene. Now, Cale is Welsh-born, and he moved to the U.S. to study classical music, and he had received a Leonard Bernstein scholarship, which is a pretty prestigious scholarship. Cale had previously worked with other experimental composers, like John Cage, who we'd mentioned before, I think back in some of the other avant-garde bands that we talked about, or even like Fairport Convention. I think he was floating around then as well. So composers like John Cage would prove influential to the sound of Velvet Underground, especially early on. Cale found that Reed was also in the same mindset and experimental in his rock music, and Cale was interested in exploring rock music, not just classical music. So they started playing together. Their first group was called the Primitives, and they recruited Sterling Morrison to play with them, and he was a former classmate of Lou Reed's at Syracuse. Then Angus McLeish joined, and he was also known by them. They changed their name to the Warlocks, and then they went by the Falling Spikes, and then they finally adopted the name Velvet Underground in November of 1965, which was the name... Yes.
Can I add one thing? Is it weird that Lou Reed went to Syracuse? Like, that just doesn't seem like it would be a fit, does it? That, like, Lou Reed was a college man?
Mm-hmm.
So...
Yeah, and he graduated, as far as I know.
So there you go.
It's not like he dropped out.
Sorry to interrupt, but yes, just very odd to see him wearing a Letterman's jacket.
Mm-hmm. He was probably... I wonder what he was like as a college boy. I don't know. They adopted the name Velvet Underground in 1965, which was the name of a paperback by author Michael Lee about the, quote, secret sexual subculture of the early 1960s. In July of 1965, they recorded a demo tape at their loft, and without the drummer, McLeish, who was very, let's say, not into actually being an artist, I would say. He refused to be tied down to a schedule and would turn up to band practice only when he wanted to. So that's not good for a band that wants to practice and get better. When they got their first paying gig, McLeish quit the band and considered them sellouts. Reed said that he was in it for the art, not for actually making money. This is when Mo Tucker came on as the drummer. Now, I didn't know this, but she had a very unusual playing style. She played standing up, and she had an abbreviated drum set of tom-toms, snare, and she turned the bass upside down. So she didn't play it, with the pedal. She played it on its side. Huh. Hitting it, and she didn't have cymbals because she hated them. So she also used mallets as much as drumsticks when playing the drums. So I don't know where all that came from. She was a friend of, or a sister of one of their friends, and that's how she got into the band. In 1965, the underground filmmaker Barbara Rubin introduced them to Andy Warhol, and he became their manager. He recommended adding Nico to the band, and as a result of knowing Andy Warhol, the band became more well known and kind of rose in prominence. Warhol also got them a recording contract with Verve Records, which was MGM owned. Now, Warhol was named the producer of their first album and let the band basically have free reign. He just did that to basically get them in the door, I think. And the band themselves became part of Warhol's multimedia roadshow called The Exploding Plastic Inevitable. or EPI. They would be playing as part of this roadshow while Warhol's films would be shown, and there would also be strobe light effects, and sometimes there would be other dancing or performances going on as well in place of the films. And this is where the band would wear sunglasses when they were playing so that they weren't affected by the strobe lights that were playing. So it sounds pretty wild. The show would play in New York, and then it would travel around as well to different art venues. It sounds like something I would hate, frankly. Their first album was titled Velvet Underground and Nico, and it was released on March 12, 1967. It was recorded mostly in April of 1966 in New York City. However, some of the songs were recorded in LA, including Sunday Morning, and it was produced by Tom Wilson.
Oh,
those
nice.
songs in LL.
Of course.
Yep.
Man, he's all over the place, this guy.
Tom Wilson produced White Light, White Heat as well, I should add.
Wow, that's so different than... Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
The album, of course, their debut album has the famous Warhol Yellow Banana with this sticker that says "Peel slowly and see" printed near the tip of the banana. And those that did remove the banana skin found a pink peeled banana underneath, which the meaning is obvious in my opinion, what they were trying to do. I didn't know about the sticker part. I have always just seen the banana, and I didn't...
Part of that that secret subculture, right?
Yeah. Sexual subculture.
I get it.
Due to a legal issue, which I will go into a little bit, when we actually talk about the debut album, MGM stopped distributing the album for about 2 months, and then it was re-released in June of 1967 at the same time as Sgt. Pepper, and did not sell well. So it lost pretty much any momentum it would have had, and then it just kind of disappeared. It did not sell particularly well. In 1982, Brian Eno famously said that while the album sold only 30,000 copies, quote, everyone who bought one of those 30,000 copies started a band.
Well, and you may remember me butchering that quote in one of our earliest episodes.
We were still young, John. Yeah. Give yourself a break.
Just as a throwback for long-term listeners. But continue.
Yep. After this, the band toured through most of 67. They then had kind of a falling out, parting of ways with Andy Warhol. Warhol basically said, "What do you want to do now? You need to think to Lou Reed. You need to think about what you want to do. Do you want to keep playing art shows and my crazy art installations, or do you want to take this band in another direction?" And then Reed basically fired him because he wanted to move away from the art scene. Steve Sesnick was brought in as a manager, who was not well liked apparently after the fact, and Cale and Reed both called him a snake in interviews that were after the band broke up. And now it brings us to White Light, White Heat. They started recording it in September of 1967 with Tom Wilson producing. Their live performances were loud, harsh, and had lots of improvisation, and they brought this to this album, as I'm sure you can tell. Warhol had an endorsement deal with Vox for them, so they got to use all the Vox equipment for free, including the pedals and different alteration type instruments. Did they take advantage of that. Yeah, really. They did record this album in 2 days. That probably makes sense too, based on how it sounds. Yeah. Sterling Morrison had said about this album that they wanted to do something energetic and electronic. He said this album is very fuzzy and has lots of white noise because they played so loud in the studio. And Cale has called this album, quote, consciously anti-beauty, which I can agree with. And then Morrison also said about this, because shortly after this, they kind of broke up, or Cale left the band after this album, and they had some other difficulties. And Morrison said, "We may have been dragging each other off a cliff, but we were all going in the same direction." So, a band that had its rocky moments. This album has been described as experimental rock, noise rock, proto-punk, art rock by different writers and critics. You've got drug use in it, sexual acts described, distortion, feedback, it's a very abrasive album and difficult album, people have said. And then the original cover of the album was a faint image of a tattoo and on a skull. And then I didn't know that because the 80s reissues had a completely black background without the arm in the background. So, John, I know you maybe think of Velvet Underground as nihilistic, but did this reinforce that for you in this our time of joy and winter and the winter of our discontent?
Let me try a CTS first, which is I'm going to try to incorporate some multimedia into my my presentation right here. So let's see if it comes through as I hope it does.
Did you get that?
No, what happened?
That was
I don't know what happened, John. We didn't hear that.
So failure to load right there. So we'll try it another time. But what I was trying to do
sound effect.
I was going to do a sound effect. It was going to be Krusty the Clown sighing loudly. Was what I was going for. Yes, there you go. That's what I was going for. So
Matt.
that's pretty much perfect. So that's what I was going for in the multimedia, but Matt did it for me. So maybe Matt is like the scat man of the group to begin with,
go.
and we'll start having him do sound effects like that Family Guy where it's what Dingo and the baby, and we'll start doing that. But anyway, that would have been much more entertaining. This album, So here's the deal. I like challenging rock music. I am going to sit here from the hills and, talk about bands like My Bloody Valentine and Sonic Youth and Yo La Tengo, who I love down the road. So, noise rock and experimental rock and distorted rock, sign me up for all of that. So this album, though, was a bleak affair. Lyrically, sound-wise, it sounded like an album that was made to just either reflect the chaos of folks that were not in a good place, and also it seemed like it was put out there to just challenge a listener to see how much they could take of that worldview, because the lyrical content is just morose, but not in a like you chuckle or sort of like you can turn it around. There's like a morality play. It's just like, body dysmorphia and death and, it's just,
drug
it's
use.
just but like the worst kind of drug use. You know what I mean? Like,
Yep.
Not like, oh, I'm gaining something from it. Like the type of drug use that someone who said we were all dragging each other off the mountain at the same time would sort of reflect. It, to me, sounds like a lot of the tragic lives that 60s artists were leading. So in that sense, it's a very good picture, I think, but it is not something that I would ever want to be a template for what music should sound like. And once again, I don't need my music to be accessible even at all times, but there was no joy that was derived by this. I mean, in the sense that these guys can play their instruments, because I do, because I know what Lou Reed sounds like after this, and I know what the initial album sounds like, and I know what future albums sound like. So it's not like these guys can't play, right? I wouldn't say it's like the Captain Beefheart album, because I think that was a totally different sonic thing they were going for, sort of A chord and stuff. And here you see them get on the tracks at times, and a lot of the disconcerting nature of the sound is from sort of a distortion and feedback, but not in a way that expands the palette, I'd say. More in a way that I think is consciously scoring these sort of disturbing parables, I guess would be the best way I could describe a lot of the songs. Whenever you end your album with a 16-minute song, you're already, strike two in terms of how I'm viewing stuff like this. So, I mean, I can understand why, if you're looking for a hard, challenging artistic listen, this could appeal to you. But I derive no pleasure from this album, and at times I was oppositionally defined to it, because I felt like they didn't really care about me as a listener and really weren't trying to add value. It was designed, I think, to challenge me and see what my breaking point was, and my breaking point hit toward the end of it, where I went not from I need to turn this off into like more of a this is what you're giving me. So there's my overall take. there wasn't really anything musically that spoke to me in this, and it doesn't surprise me the band was not long for the world after this. I think one more album without John Cale, right? So I mean, there you go. So.
I think this was Cale's last album, though, wasn't it?
That's what I'm saying.
He did two albums with him, I thought.
That's what I'm saying. He left, and the last Velvet Underground album is very different than this. And then, what Lou Reed did was very different than this. So, thumbs down on this one for me, I have to say. And not because it's too much for me. More so, this doesn't really reflect the type of stuff that I think in the same time period was as influential or as moving or as artistically relevant to the modern day. Yeah.
Okay. All right, Matt, what do you think?
Yeah, this is definitely a hard listen, and the first time I listened to it, I pretty much hated it. But I did like it on subsequent listens. Not to the point where I was like amazed or blown away, but I found it much less offensive the second and third times that I listened to it. I agree with John, and I think Josh, you alluded to, I think Cale said, they're consciously trying to sound like this, right? Mm-hmm. And whether that's because this is the artistic vision that they had, or this was more of a let's see how we can mess with people type of thing and just see how different we can be and how, abrasive, I think you used that word, Josh, that's a good word to describe this. So it's hard to know exactly what their motivation really was, but I think things like The Gift was a good example. The first time, that's like the 8-minute long story about the guy who ships himself to the ex-girlfriends, and she opens up the box with a I don't know, a box cutter or whatever, and splits his head open. And I kept waiting for that. I'm like, the first time I'm listening to this, I'm thinking, all right, we'll kick in with something here, right? Because I thought the groove was okay, and it just doesn't. It's just that groove, that bass line, that drum beat, a little bit of guitar in the background for over 8 minutes, and John Cale reciting a story about this, right?
Yeah.
So it's not. I hesitate to even call that a song, really.
Yeah.
But I did like the groove. I liked the beat and the groove, and it was something that once I was like, okay, I know what the story is, whatever. I don't have to pay attention to lyrics. His voice is in the background. It's kind of just there. And I thought that was kind of a cool groove. I like that, right? And,
could you listen to it, though, for 8 minutes? That's the thing. It's like, even if, okay. And maybe that's your jam band background, because for me, it's like, all right, and I don't... Maybe at minute 1, but by minute 6, it's like, all right, like, God, there's no groove this good that you can.
And that's right, and that's totally understandable. And I'm not saying that it was this earth-shattering, sound for me. I'm just saying that as I was listening to it, it's more like background music, and I don't mind if there's like a groove, you can play something over and over again for many, many minutes, upwards of 8-10 minutes. And I'll stick with it if I like it, I don't. Having said that, I don't know if this is something I'm going to be, playing a whole lot. But I'm saying, like, once I realized what it was, I let that go and just let it happen, and I was fine with it, to be honest. I liked the third and fourth. I thought White Light, White Heat. I had known that song. That's fine. That's kind of little I hesitate to call it catchy, but it's as catchy, I think, maybe as anything on this record. It would be that song. And then the third and fourth tracks, more low key, kind of that, mellow. A little droning is not a bad word, but I also didn't mind those at all. And then you have side B, which is the cacophony of like all this, like that to me is where this starts to sound a little bit like the Captain Beefheart record, in that it sounds like I equated it again to like Bill and Ted playing their guitars in the garage of just trying to, play something, and it's like there's very little form. But I will say, in the beginning of Sister Ray, the first, 6 or 7 minutes of that song, there is structure there. There is there is a backing beat, and I like that part of the song. And then they get later on, then they just goes off the rails, and it's like, all right, it kind of comes back a little bit, but the majority of that song is a hard listen. Incidentally, I also the second time I listened to this was that night that I listened to Satanic Majesty's Request, and I was buzzed when I listened to that. So I was like, maybe this is a better album to listen to when you've had a couple of beers in you, right?
Yeah.
So John, I hear everything you're saying, and I'm not going to go and argue with any of it. This is not an album that I think I can really recommend. But I will say I was surprised upon second, third. I think maybe I got to a fourth time listening to it. I don't hate this album. I think that I see a place for it, but this is not for most people. And I will say, though, it is interesting to see that this is in the 60s, right? Because this does sound like, the sound here does sound like, how you can see where, the indie rock music scene, really derived in some way from this. I'm not saying they were the end all be all, but I can totally see why bands like you mentioned before, John, like Yo La Tango or like, Sonic Youth or whoever, the noise rock kind of thing, was at least in part influenced by this. I'm not familiar with other Velvet Underground stuff, so I'm looking forward to listening to it. I hope it gets better, and I'm assuming that it does, but I'm not going to totally pan this. It was a surprising, I'm okay with this, is the best way that I can put it, I think.
Yeah.
I'm going to let Josh give his take, because I think I'm going to finally unveil my hottest of hot takes that I've been saving for a little while after it, and I don't want to step on Josh's take. So, Josh, all yours, but I'm going to come back to it.
So I totally hear what you guys are saying, and I think both of your opinions are valid, and the kind of the contexting this in the 60s with how kind of explicit it is with drug use and sexual acts and things like that, and how transgressive it is in that. Despite all of that, I really like this album for some reason.
Wow, really?
Yeah, I've liked this album since college probably, and I don't know what it is about it. The droning nature doesn't bother me. I find it much more easy to listen to than Captain Beefheart. I think because the background of kind of the blues riffs that are in it, or the rhythm that's in it, and kind of the droning nature of the songs makes it easy for me to listen to. I could listen to Sister Ray probably on repeat for whatever reason. I think it gets the most abrasive, like on I Heard Her Call My Name.
Yeah.
And I think White Light, White Heat is just very catchy because of that piano beat that Cale puts down on it. And I think I could take or leave The Gift. I'm not saying this is like one of my favorite albums ever, but I think it's funny. For some reason, I think it's funny when Lou Reed comes in on The Gift with the thoughts that the nurse has, where he just comes in like very deadpan and saying like "sweet" and like whatever. After Cale is reciting the song, I feel like this album. I totally get why people wouldn't like this album, but I don't know. There's something about it that I like. It's probably the same. It's kind of along the same lines as why I like the Stooges album, although I like that album more. I guess the word that comes to mind for this album for me is scuzzy, and it's really scuzzy, and I kind of like that feeling, especially in the 60s, when it doesn't seem like anything else we've listened to does this. I don't know why I don't have a problem with it on this album versus other albums that we've listened to. Maybe it's just like they are good guitar players, and I think that comes through despite their attempt to be anti, contrary about that. I don't know why this album is so high on the chart, on our list. It probably could be further back, in my opinion. But especially as influential as the first album is, it doesn't need to be as close. But
not only that, though, but the Velvet Underground are ranked 9 of the best artists of all time on best ever albums, right behind number 8 of the Rolling Stones.
Yeah,
you guys are setting me up for my rant here in a second. So continue, because I look forward to unveiling that.
I do like. So I guess there is a mono version of this album as well, but I like in the stereo version on The Gift, which is this version that's on Spotify. You get the music in the right speaker the whole time, and you get the Cale saying in the dialogue in the left speaker, which I think is an interesting use. And they also used a cantaloupe to indicate like the smacking of the head with a knife in that song, which I learned. Sister Ray is named after Ray Davies from the Kinks. Lou Reed said. And And I do feel
I'm sure he was honored based on their shared vision of lyrical
melody.
Structure.
Yeah. This, and then finally, I would say that I do feel like all noise rock kind of comes from this. I mean, I'm sure there were other bands that were doing it, but it makes me appreciate those later bands. For some, which will, when we get to those, I'm eager to hear them and compare them to this. My final note: it was on the Billboard Top 200 for a mere 2 weeks at spot 199 before falling off, which I thought was funny, appropriate.
I have to say, I'm surprised, Josh. I did not see that coming from you. So that's that. Wow. Okay.
That's my
all right,
Christmas
John.
hot take. Yeah,
John, lay it on us.
So I think what this album represents to me, and why I hate this album so much, I think it represents to me something that I see in the 60s that really agitates me. Let me start by saying that I understand the influence of this album because Lord knows there's as Josh said, this created noise rock to some degree. I would argue that it created it in the sense that they did it and then other people improved on it by a factor of about 900. But it's the template for where that came from. I can totally appreciate that bands I love, like Roxy Music and the Smiths and stuff, like will up and down. I mean, I think Morrissey at one point was the head of the British Velvet Underground fan club, right? And, he takes certainly the morose lyrics and stuff, albeit he does it in a totally different way on Smith's albums in terms of what he scores it with behind it. But this album to me and the Velvet Underground in general represents what I think is probably my biggest annoyance with the best ever album charts sometimes. And it's not best ever album. It's more what music criticism was. I think that there was a concerted effort in the 60s to lionize certain things as art that weren't necessarily high art so much as they were just countercultural and different to be different. And I think along the way there was a loss of differentiation between stuff that was creating art and pushing boundaries, like the Beatles albums that we're doing, or Pet Sounds, or when we did Sly and the Family Stone, and just different stuff that was great. We're doing these album reviews of the current Rolling Stone Top 500 albums. And what stands out to me is that in revisionist looks, people are going back and they're finding music that sounds good and is still profound. And I feel like we're running into, and Matt, you're going to get angry with me with this, but there's a lot of different bands, and there's a desire to take every Dylan album and make it high art. And to, certainly the Velvets, right? 3 albums in the top 30. I think there was a certain type of person who became a music critic in the 60s. And the funny thing was they were all tripping over themselves to, create a consensus. And the funny thing was they all ended up being sycophantic in terms of liking the same stuff. And that's what really stands out to me. In no other decade, when you look at the albums, is there such a lack of fun in a lot of the albums that are lionized as great pieces of art as we see here. And I also think what's been sacrificed along the way is, voices of women, voices of, anybody of color, along the way that doesn't fit into a conscription of, this is challenging to a college educated person who doesn't rage against the, supposed machine. And all I can think of is like these people ended up probably becoming like Reagan Democrats or like dying young, and that's fine, but you know what I mean? I just don't know if this stuff holds up because I don't know if what that era celebrated is something that I want celebrated. And I'm kind of glad that music criticism moved away from having 3 Velvet Underground albums in the top 30. And I don't mean to pick on Velvet Underground, but let's be honest. There ain't another decade where you're getting Trout Mask Replica and 3 Velvet Underground albums and, every Dylan album is high art and, and you're not getting stuff that and we're about to do Magical Mystery Tour and stuff, and you can see these huge seismic shifts art wise, and see here we're going to be talking about an album that moved the bar in music, and it's being debated against an album where a bunch of people were pretty miserable fucks and decided to make an album that was as decidedly hard to listen to as possible. And that's fine, and I get it from an art standpoint. I truly do, because there's a place for that, but that doesn't mean I have to accept that the higher degree of difficulty is making a challenging piece of art that also sounds good and stands the test of time. And this, unlike you guys, I do not feel that this transcends the decade. I feel it sounds very much like an album in the late 60s, just with elements that came later. And so I don't mean to sound overwhelmingly negative, but all I could think of is you've got all of these people with musical talent. There's obviously production here, and it was just wasted on like a burnout album, and it's like, I don't know. I don't feel like I need to celebrate like a burnout album that like later people say is a revolutionary piece of art. Like, I don't feel that I need to do it. And I totally understand the alternative standpoint of it. And I'm not saying that I'm right on this. I feel it's important for me to kind of let you know where I'm coming from. When I was younger, I might have tried to trip over myself to justify this, but like, I'm at the point in my life now where like life's too short to listen to albums that consciously are trying to like offend me, And so there's my hot take. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, critics at that time were, part of the counterculture, and I'm sure they were trying to push boundaries in their own ways and bring music that wasn't quote unquote the pop music at the time, which was, probably Motown and, high stuff on the charts before like Poptimism kind of took off later on, finding value in the popular accessible songs or music.
Well, but these are the people that said Led Zeppelin sucked. You know what I mean? Because it was just too derivative, right? And it's like, that's kind of what I'm getting at. It's like Black Sabbath sucked because it was too sludgy and, made for people that drank beers instead it took the right psychedelics. That's kind of what I rage against. It's like, would you rather, if you're anybody under the age of 40, would you rather listen to this album or would you rather listen to some of those albums or even stuff like, later Beach Boys or like Herman's Hermits or Mamas and the Papas and the Monkey, there's a lot of things that were derided as low, lightweight stuff that it's like, now everybody knows they were fucking fantastic and they always were fantastic. They just were sacrificed at the altar of like this stuff. And that offends me a little bit, because those groups went out of their way to try to create a piece of art that was complicated, but got sort of poo-pooed for this, where a bunch of guys who were in the right scenesters didn't even bother to write licks that made sense. It's like if the Strokes didn't write good songs,
Well, it's funny because this conversation is dovetailing into a conversation I had with Sherry early in the week when she made the comment that, she likes listening to these episodes, but she's looking forward to when we get into kind of like the 80s and 90s where it'll be a little bouncier, poppier type stuff. And I was like, well, Sherry, I don't think we're going to be covering like Madonna, when we get to the 80s and 90s. I mean, it's like the Pixies and like the Cure and the Smith. And she's
but it's
like,
also Michael Jackson and Prince and all kinds of other stuff that acknowledges that stuff exists outside of just
That's true. Yeah. But it was just funny because I said, and I looked it up and I'm like, Madonna, her highest ranked album here is Ray of Light, and that wasn't even in the 80s or 90s. That was like 2000, and it was like, and it's 130 or something like that. So it's so she made the comment. She's like, I think critics need to get different taste or something like, or better taste. And I think that's John. It takes to what you're saying though, is that rock critics are looking for something that the masses aren't in general. I mean, it's a very kind of like simplistic way of putting it, but that's essentially what's happening. And it does. Look, I didn't hate this record like you did, John, and I didn't like it as much as Josh did. But I would agree that this probably doesn't belong this high, right? Like, I think that there's plenty of other albums that we've covered, and ones we haven't that we could all probably agree that should be higher than this.
Right.
But I would also say, you're talking about the critics of the 60s and being part of the counterculture. Isn't this list that we're going by, it's not just based on the 60s, it's based on lists that people are doing now.
Yes,
so
but
this
heavily
is still
weighted
in
into,
It's still in retrospect, though, right? And I don't know exactly the algorithm that they're using, but this is not just people are still hanging on to this in some way, shape, or form. So I would just say that it's not just the 60s; it's still today too.
But just take a look at the charts we'll cover down the road. And I want you to really ask yourself this question. When we get to the 70s, there's critical darlings in there, but there's also space for Fleetwood Mac and Van Halen and Boston and Stevie Wonder and Marvin Gaye. You know what I'm saying? And it's in the 80s. There's space for Guns N' Roses. There's space for U2.
There better be.
Well, but you get what I'm saying? Do you think the critics of the late 60s would like Guns N' Roses, or would they say, oh, they're just derivative hog, compared to like early Pink Floyd or, this Dylan album, or, I mean, I guarantee you they'd say what they said about like Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath, derivative, monster rock for guys with too much testosterone.
But we are covering Zeppelin
artist. Every African American artist, with the exception of a select amount of like matriarchal African American women, right, are largely going to get ignored because they're going to say it's too lightweight and made for another audience. There's no singer-songwriters who are female anywhere to be found, despite the fact that Joni Mitchell and Laura Nyro were all there. You know what I mean? Those people do show up in the 70s and 80s and 90s. So clearly even critics realized, this isn't a way to appreciate music. And, by the time we get to the 90s, we're going to be, like, all over the place. There's going to be hip-hop. There's going to be R&B. There's going to be female singer-songwriters like Liz Phair and Tori Amos and PJ Harvey. Do you think those folks show up on this? And that's what I'm getting at. As we go through the 60s albums, I get more and more annoyed at, who rates and who doesn't. And I know what you're saying. There's maybe not going to be Madonna or like, Britney Spears, right? But there certainly is a space for, Michael Jackson, Prince, all kinds of different people. And, when we get to the 2010s, suddenly you can put a Taylor Swift album in the top 100 and people aren't like, aghast that you could sell albums and by the way, it might actually be good too. And I think sometimes these albums are and I think it takes away from groups like the Beatles, or even like what the Kinks did last week with Village Preservation, where they did these really well constructed beautiful albums they put a lot of thought into, and it just gets thrown into the same pile as a bunch of guys who did a lot of drugs and just were like, let's make a really difficult album over 2 days. But it's complicated in the eyes, so that's kind of what I get at. It's like, it sort of pisses all over the craft that people were putting out in the 60s. And really, I think it doesn't do it any favors. So anyway, end of hot take.
It gets into the nature and evolution of rock criticism itself, right? I mean, there was no rock critics before they started writing about music in the 60s, or rock music in the 60s, I should say, with these albums. So I think the mindset of what popular music and rock music and then other genres of music can represent changes over time and reflects what society views as valuable or what is artistic or has value, I should say. So they were laying foundation, I'm guessing, 99 or 100% male white males were, writing about this stuff with nobody before them to base their opinions on or to build off of. So, they're kind of the forefathers of how we are today.
Yeah. Well, and Zeppelin did make it. I mean, we're still covering Zeppelin in the 60s, so it's not like, but your point's taken, John. And I was just looking quickly through, our albums in the 60s from, the higher ranked, or the lower ranked numbers. But there's not a whole lot. I mean, you've got like Aretha Franklin, you've got Dusty Springfield, you've got some representation of some of the stuff that you're talking about. But I think that it'll be interesting to kind of look forward, because I bet, that seems like it would bear out that this decade seems a little, I don't know, more narrowly focused maybe than others.
Sure.
And I think Josh makes a good point as well, that it was kind of the nature of the rock critic and what they were used to. And, but again, this is also still people looking back, and still people today love the Velvet Underground, and will tell you that they're just this amazingly influential band. But I would still rather listen to the Supremes. Probably that Supremes album, which was like 250 or something on this list,
And I don't take away from the effect of the Velvet Underground, but my take is we all know that Velvet Underground with Nico is the album you get if you're going to get the Velvet Underground, right? Yeah. So I don't know why there needs to be 3 albums. You know what I mean? Like, you could still have the representation without the entire catalog. And I think that's where you start to sacrifice, other willing, other
Yeah.
acts. Yeah.
Yep.
So
I know we're running long here, but Josh, did Nico was that was certainly just a one-off, right? Like, was there any talk of her like being on this album or another one?
Nope, they parted ways with her after that first album. That she kind of coincided with Andy Warhol, so I think once they parted ways with her, she was brought in to, kind of bolster the band or make them, she was, as John has said, she was in the scene at the time, and she was desired and an it girl and all that, and Andy Warhol brought her in to boost their profile. Yep. So